From the section on communicating science, this is the talk on the essay of the same title on communicating science, and also on avoid the technical talk scientists told, use clear language. I've combined these two. So we're going to combine the first two articles since they're brief in the first couple of slides here. So we're first introduced to this idea, which now seems a little strange to us, that of communicating science and it's being inappropriate. And there's actually a kind of a tradition at play here that goes back for a lot longer than the author indicates. It goes back, literally for thousands of years. There's records of Plato supposedly scolding Aristotle, and Aristotle was one of Plato's students for publishing too much. That is, and what that meant at the time was writing down too much of his work and putting it in the library in Athens where anyone could read it. So, and we see that type of tradition playing out with it somehow cheapening science, or with it being written so that it can be understood by the general public as being a type of dumbing down. But today we see more of a trend towards the opposite. And I personally think that, that if the writer has done a good job, then it's not going to be dumbed down if it's explained clearly enough. So, and some other things that have changed. Certainly, taxpayers are concerned about how their money is used for funding science, and of course, we saw that playing out with stem cell research. President Bush, he didn't entirely get rid of stem cell research, but he did limit new lines from being developed. So it did kind of slow things down in the United States somewhat. And of course, if we don't develop the technology, then eventually we'll have to import it and pay even more for it, conceivably, and not have it available as soon. So, the authors also talk about the idea of rhetorical theory and its relevance to science in public life. And so that has to do with, again, with our responsibility as citizens for learning about about all these different scientific advancements, and the as we move more and more towards an e-democracy, or as we know today, if let's say there's a huge storm that covers the Midwest and the East Coast on election day, voter turnout is going to be a lot lower than if the weather's nice, and we know, unfortunately, that's a fact. The in the two images to the right, that's the guy to the far right is Siddhartha Mukherjee, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Emperor of All Maladies. He's actually a cancer researcher. And his more recent book is about the gene. And the argument that he makes in that book is that eventually we're going to have to start making decisions about what we're going to do about gene editing. And something that's been in the news very recently, in the last week or so, is a scientist in China who got in trouble for genetically editing the DNA of twins. I think it was twin girls. What they're not talking about, though, everybody's talking about how horrible that is, and it is. What they're not talking about, though, is the reason that he did it. The reason he did it is because the father of these two children was HIV positive. And what he did is he tinkered with the gene that will make these children more receptive to HIV in an attempt to keep them from ever having it. So Of course, it's a kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. It's kind of like we, if we take our vaccinations and then we don't get the flu or whatever disease, we don't know for certain that the vaccination worked or not, unless we don't take the vaccination and then we get the disease. So, anyway, it's unfortunate for his career. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out in the future, though. And we are moving in the direction of having a more literal democracy. We certainly, a part of our knowledge about democracy in ancient Greece, we know that more people were more active in the democratic process. They did still vote for representatives. That one difference when they really started moving towards democracy was getting away from a dependence on tribes and more of a dependence on the where people lived instead. There's also, but we're moving towards, I guess, towards people being able to vote without leaving their homes, and so they'll be even more active. Mukherjee also makes a reference to Aristotle, drawing an analogy between what we now know as the gene working upon us as a carpenter works upon wood. Something else that's happened is that there's more of a hunger for knowledge. Now, something that we're hearing about today is all the trouble in the book industry. The book industry is in trouble. And if you like to read fiction, you may have heard that that's especially true. Fewer novels are being sold. Though I understand this past Christmas that there were more books, physical printed books being bought than had been the past. So perhaps that trend is starting to reverse itself. But actually, something that has carried the publishing industry for a long time is nonfiction, and what we're seeing is more of a hunger for nonfiction. That's started to express itself in more people writing memoirs, but also the number of science books that are published each year. There's a series that's published by Norton called the Great Discovery Series, and you can, if you want to look at this, you can Google Norton Great Discovery Series, and I put a bit of what's available. It's like now it's like 10 books. When I first became aware of this, it was like 14. It's been trimmed back to 10. But of those 10 authors, literally 5 of them are novelists, and just these are listed. The ones that are listed here: Quammen, Volman, Levitt, and Bell are all novelists. They all have have also written several novels. So, but this is something that they're doing in order to get paid. And I know that another author who was on this series, David Foster Wallace, he died about 10 years ago, but he wrote a book that was a part of this series, and he said that he got he just got like 10 times as much money for writing one of these books than he did for one of his novels. So another trend that we're seeing in communicating science is the involvement of what we refer to as citizen scientists. And these really take a very broad range, or they're drawn from a broad range. When I talk about citizen scientists, one that we hear about quite often are amateur astronomers, they're not just looking at the night sky and taking advantage of using much more sophisticated equipment for photography than they had in the past, so they're also doing that, and sometimes discovering comets and things like that. And there's even one case where a comet that was going to wind up coming pretty close to us that the professional astronomers were not aware of was first discovered by an amateur astronomer. And it never posed any threat to us, but just the fact that they were able to identify something like that before the professional astronomers says something about the role that they're currently playing. So, and then they're also able to not only to watch the night sky, but they can also there are some scenarios where they can get into NASA databases and look at different types of data that's being transmitted back to NASA. And this is, this is something that is okay for them to do, but they're making discoveries in that fashion. An amateur scientist recently discovered another planet from some of this open access data. So we have those types of citizen scientists, and then we have other citizens who are participating in science in a different way. And these are people who are participating in stem cell therapies and things like that, other types of medical treatments that are experimental. And it could be that they have a terminal illness, but they're willing to, to take this chance on possibly being cured, knowing that they may also give their life perhaps a little bit more quickly. So we have all this involvement that we didn't used to have, and that involvement, it needs to be respected, and it needs to I think the information needs to be available. And we're also seeing different types of authors of science texts emerging. Of course, we have some scientists who are perfectly good writers. The one of the one of the more notable ones in physics would be Brian Greene, who wrote The Elegant Universe, and he's written several books since then on what's cutting edge experimental physics at the atomic level. So. And then there are others who are writing about medical scientists. And then we have journalists who gain a great deal of expertise from reporting on these subjects over a period of years who are writing books. And then we have others as well. So, questions? I'll see you online.